So today we start with the Phillips curve, and the Phillips curve is kind of like just another way of looking at the ASAD model. So you'll see that there's actually not much that's new when we look at this Phillips curve business. So you should have done a reading on it, which will be helped you out. Okay, so the Phillips curve, what is it? The Phillips curve is the relationship between inflation and unemployment. Remember, the ASAD model is the relationship between prices and output. Changes in prices is inflation, and we know that output is directly linked to employment. So if we're looking at a Phillips curve with inflation and unemployment, we're looking at a very similar model to our ASAD model, which looks at prices and output. Except it does deal with two important components of economics directly, right, or macroeconomics, which is inflation and unemployment. So, what we see is that the Phillips curve, well, here's a diagram of our Phillips curve. You can see it's a downward sloping relationship. We plot our inflation rate against our unemployment rate. But essentially what happens is we have a very simple equation. Essentially we say that the unemployment rate, in other words, whatever the level of unemployment is simply the natural rate adjusted for the difference between what people expect inflation to be and what inflation actually is. So we've spoken about this already when we've spoken about the idea that we have sticky wages, right? When we've spoken about sticky prices, and we've spoken about the fact that when we're dealing with the short run, what's happening is that people's nominal wages are not adjusting appropriately to the actual change in prices. Right? In other words, they set their wages according to what they expected inflation to be. Then, when the time comes, we have some actual measure of inflation, and if what people expected inflation to be and what it was actually are different, right, then we see that we get a change in real wages, because nominal wages are fixed for a while, but prices are changing, which means that the real wage is messing around, right? So we've got the same thing here. We have actual inflation, what it actually is, what people thought it was going to be, and the difference between these two affects our unemployment rate. And what it does is it takes our natural rate and adjusts that natural rate to get to our actual unemployment rate. So basically this equation here is telling us nothing we haven't really spoken about before, right? That the amount of people employed, right, which is obviously directly linked to the unemployment rate, is influenced by what people expected inflation to be and how that differs to what it actually is. And just like in our ASAD model, we have a difference between the short run aggregate supply curve and the long run aggregate supply curve. We have a difference in the short run and the long run Phillips curve. And the reason we have a short run and a long run Phillips curve is for the same reason that we have a short run and a long run aggregate supply curve. So there's, like I said, it's just basically another way of looking at the ASAD model. So let's begin then to look at the short run Phillips curve. Okay, it's a negative relationship. What does that mean? Well, it means if we're plotting inflation rate against unemployment rate, it is downward sloping. As inflation goes down, we expect unemployment to go up. Okay? If inflation goes up, we expect unemployment to go down, which is just another way of looking at the short run aggregate supply curve. Because what does the short run aggregate supply curve tell us? If prices go up, we expect employment to go up, which is the same as saying if we expect prices to go up, what do we expect unemployment to do? Unemployment should go down, which is what our Phillips curve is telling us. If prices go up, we expect unemployment to go down. So if you remember in that reading by Blanchard, when he talks about the labor market, right, when he's got his labor demand curve and his labor supply curve, but he calls them the price setting equation and the wage setting or relation, I think is the term he uses, right? Remember that diagram, that set of things that he spoke about? Remember, in his labor market, he didn't plot employment, he plotted unemployment. Remember that? So instead of having an upward sloping supply curve, he had a downward sloping wage setting relation. Remember that? Because he was plotting unemployment instead of employment. If you plotted employment, it would have been an upward sloping relationship. It's exactly what's happening here. If we plot employment, in other words, if we plot output, we have an upward sloping supply curve. If we plot unemployment against inflation, right, we have essentially a downward sloping, what is called the Phillips curve, but it's basically just another way of looking at the supply curve, right? So in the same way that Blanchard had the wage setting relation, which was the same, almost the same as a labor supply curve, so the Phillips curve is almost the same as an aggregate supply curve. The only difference is with the aggregate supply curve, we are plotting employment, and with the Phillips curve, we are plotting unemployment. And then the distinction here between inflation and price level, obviously it's not, price and inflation are not exactly the same, but they're close enough that we can consider them the same for now. Okay, so what happens? As an example, let's say we're at equilibrium at point A, and we have an increase in aggregate demand. Are you happy that we would get a new equilibrium position at point B with an increase in aggregate demand? You happy with that? So with that shift in aggregate demand, we've moved from point A to point B, which is the equivalent in the Phillips curve as moving from point A to point B, right? In other words, we had some initial price level and some initial level of employment, and therefore some initial unemployment rate. With the increase in aggregate demand, prices rose. With that rise in prices, we would have had an increase in inflation. An increase in inflation has led to a decrease in output. In other words, with that increase, a decrease in unemployment. With that increase in output, we've had an increase in employment and therefore a decrease in the unemployment rate. And so with the inflation going up, unemployment has gone down. And that's about as complicated as the Phillips curve relationship gets. Now all we need to know is what happens when we shift. Okay. So what we've seen is that the Phillips curve, a movement along the Phillips curve is like a movement along the supply curve, short run aggregate supply curve. You happy with that? So then the question becomes one of, well, what happens if we shift the short run aggregate supply curve? So, we were initially at some point, it's not labeled here, but let's call it point A. Okay, you with me? That's point A. That would correspond to some point on our Phillips curve, badly marked, but let's call it there point A as well. You happy with that? The increase in aggregate demand from AD to AD1 would move us from point A here to point B on our initial aggregate supply curve. You happy with that? In our Phillips curve, there would be a movement from imaginary point A here to imaginary point B here. You happy with that? Okay. If we are now at this point here, where we're intersecting AS and AD1, if our aggregate supply curve were to shift to the left in response to that increase in prices, and we can talk about more why it would shift to the left in a moment. If our aggregate supply curve shifts from AS to AS1, right? That would be the equivalent of shifting our Phillips curve to the right. How much does our Phillips curve shift by? Well, what would have to happen is with our new aggregate supply curve and our new aggregate demand curve, if they brought us back to the initial level of output, which is the initial level of unemployment, right? There will be some new price level, and therefore some inflation rate associated with that, a new rate of inflation associated with our initial level of output and unemployment, and so we would shift our Phillips curve to be with a new rate of inflation at our same level of output, right? So our Phillips curve is shifted to the right. You happy with that idea? I mean, we've drawn lines that just go from what we measured here is inflation, and so now it's also inflation, right? So we've now swapped price for inflation in our ASAD model. And that's why I say, for now, we can just consider price and inflation as basically being the same thing. But there is a technical difference, we're not worrying about it for now. And the Phillips curve must have inflation, and your ASAD model should always have price here, although we put inflation just to make the mapping of those two diagrams easier to follow. Okay, you happy with that idea? So we know what shifts the Phillips curve. Basically, a shift in the Phillips curve is caused by a shift in the aggregate supply curve. And so once again, we see that the Phillips curve is just another way of looking at the aggregate supply curve. Okay. What are the implications of this Phillips curve? It's interesting, I suppose. What it's telling us, we already knew when we were looking at our aggregate demand curve model, which is that policymakers can't achieve both low unemployment and low inflation. In other words, if government has an expansionary fiscal policy, or if the Reserve Bank uses an expansionary monetary policy, if in either one of those cases they want to use expansionary policy in order to increase output, what is the unintended, well, you can say unintended, although you should know it's going to happen, maybe. Right? What is the unintended consequence of that desire to increase output? What happens? We get inflation. Right? So, how then does the government achieve both low inflation and high levels of output, which is to say high levels of employment? The model suggests that they can't. Right? They have to decide, are they going to take high levels of employment, or are they going to take high levels, or they're going to take low levels of inflation. They can't have both, is what the model suggests. So, again, let's then talk, why does our aggregate supply curve shift to the left? In our discussions previously, remember we said that if there was an increase in aggregate demand, started driving up prices, but nominal wages were fixed, right? So we got a temporary increase in employment with that decrease in real wages. However, when we came back to the next wage setting negotiations, people would say, no, hang on, we're not happy with our old nominal wage level because prices didn't adjust according to what we thought they were going to adjust. We want higher nominal wages, right? So what happens in our labor markets? People want higher wages, right? With higher wages, less people get employed, number one. But number two, what does a higher nominal wage look like, excuse me, in our ASAD model? It's a shift to the left of the aggregate supply curve. Remember that? Hopefully. Okay? In other words, if people adjust their nominal wages because they're adjusting their inflation expectations, then we are shifting the aggregate supply curve either to the right or to the left. If they increase their nominal wages in response to an increase in what they expect inflation to be, then we shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. You happy with that? In other words, as people increase their inflation expectations and in response increase their nominal wage demands, so the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, and so the Phillips curve shifts to the right. What we end up with is, at any level of unemployment, a higher inflation expectation. That's what our Phillips curve is telling us. As our Phillips curve shifts to the right, any given level of unemployment is just matched with higher inflation expectations, which is what's happening when our aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. It's telling us that that increase in prices is making people want higher wages. And as they want higher wages, so less people are employed. And so all we end up with, especially if we look at our case of shifting from AD, call it 0, so AD 0 and AS 0, as we shift from this point where they intersect to this point AD 1 and AS 1, what we're left with is higher prices but the same level of employment, the same level of output. In other words, we're sitting at the same unemployment rate, but now people expect inflation to be higher and prices rise accordingly, and wages as well. Real wages, however, would be unchanged. If we were to be consider this point here A versus, let's call this point D. So point A versus point D, the real wage would be unchanged. With higher prices, with higher nominal wages, higher inflation expectations, the same level of output, the same level of unemployment, the same real wage. So then, let's think about what the long run Phillips curve could represent. And if you've been following the discussion, even if you haven't done the readings, you should already be leaning to an understanding of what the long run Phillips curve is going to be linked to. The short run Phillips curve is linked to the short run aggregate supply curve. The next step is quite straightforward. So the short run Phillips curve is not constant over time. What happens? We see that it shifts as people adjust their inflation expectations, adjust their nominal wage demands in relation to actual inflation, to actual price changes. As those prices change, so people adjust their inflation expectations, they adjust their expectations about how prices will change, and so they adjust their nominal wage demands. But what would happen if this was our aggregate demand, aggregate supply situation? If that initial point there had, which we're calling point A, if at point A we had been at full employment, that increase in aggregate demand, let's call it expansionary fiscal policy, what did it do? In the short run, it led to a temporary increase in employment and a rise in prices. In the long run, however, all it led to was inflation, right? And no change in output, no change in employment. So if our initial point A had been at full employment, what we would ultimately end up with is a point D, a point with higher prices but the same level of output, the same full employment rate, right? In other words, if we're looking at point A initially on our short run Phillips curve, when aggregate demand shifted, we moved to point B, right? As prices went up and employment went up. Then when people realized that prices had changed and that their real wages had fallen because their nominal wages had not adjusted appropriately, they set their higher real wages and then adjust their inflation expectations. Our short run aggregate supply curve shifts and our Phillips curve shifts, and it brings us to a new point in our Phillips curve diagram, point C. Point C would correspond to that point D in the ASAD model, that imaginary point D, that we call point D. In other words, this point C would correspond with this point D in our ASAD model. In other words, if point A and point D were at the full employment level of employment, we could draw a vertical line through these 2 points, and that would represent our long run aggregate supply curve. You happy with that? Yeah? In which case, our long run aggregate supply curve is vertical at some point of output. Our long run Phillips curve is vertical at some point of some rate of unemployment, the natural rate of unemployment. At the natural rate of unemployment, right? What we're saying is, it doesn't matter what the prices are, it doesn't matter what the inflation rate is. All we will end up with is some natural rate of unemployment. Change aggregate demand, change short-run aggregate supply. What you're doing is you're moving either along a Phillips curve or shifting a Phillips curve. But ultimately, you're going to end up at your natural rate of unemployment. In other words, what the long-run Phillips curve tells us is that the rate of unemployment is independent of the price level, or independent of the rate of inflation. Right? Which is another way of saying what we said before, which is that the level of output, the real level of output, does not depend on prices in the long run. Right? Because what is our production function? Y is a function of labor, capital, technology, not prices. Okay? The amount of output we can produce is dependent on the amount of input, how much resources we have available for us to use. Doesn't matter what the price level does, it doesn't change the amount of stuff we have to use, so it doesn't change the amount of stuff we can produce. So it doesn't change the full employment level of employment. It doesn't change the full employment level of output. It doesn't change the natural rate of unemployment. And so we have a long-run vertical Phillips curve. So once again, if we're comparing our ASAD model with the long-run Phillips curve, if we move from a point A to a point B on our long-run aggregate supply curve, it would be the same as moving from some point A to a higher point above point A, called a point B, on our long-run Phillips curve. And all we've got is an increased rate of inflation, in other words, higher prices with no change in output, no change in the employees there. Cool. So again, what does this imply? It just tells us that employment is not dependent on inflation. If it's not dependent on inflation, it means it's not dependent on money growth. Because we see that in the long run, what happens when you change money supply? You shift aggregate demand. You shift aggregate demand, that changes prices. That change in prices leads to changes in nominal wages, which shifts aggregate supply, and so we end up at the full employment level. So money supply then is only, changes in money supply is a short run thing. Right? Changes in money supply doesn't affect the amount of output we can produce. It doesn't affect the employment rate in the long run, only in the short run. And that is the Phillips curve. There's really nothing more exciting about it. So as long as you understand everything that comes before the Phillips curve should be pretty easy. So yeah, the better you understand, the better you'll grab this stuff. Yeah. Yes. That's right. So the implication of both this Phillips curve diagram and really the ASAD model as well is the same, and that implication is that any government agency, whether it is the Reserve Bank or it is Treasury, right? Any government policy interaction in the markets, fiscal policy, monetary policy, is going to have only a short run effect. Yeah. No. So the idea that Is private spending more efficient than government spending? The general, the theory behind it, if we can say that, it's not really something we discussed in the course, right? But it has to do with incentives and keeping costs down and all that kind of stuff. Generally what would happen is, if a product or a service was going to be delivered, and it was going to be delivered by either government or by the private sector, the private sector has more of an incentive to keep costs down because they get more profit than the government. Which means that there are two services being delivered. The one that's going to be delivered at the lowest cost, which also means the lowest opportunity cost, in the sense that what are we giving up to have that service given to us? We give up the least if it's done through the private sector than the government sector, because the government sector doesn't really have any opportunity to the cost. How does that reflect in the way you view things around you? You have ineffective civil servants. You have, guys that build roads, and you'll see the guys digging ditches, and there's one guy, digging, and three guys kind of standing there watching the guy with the spade. It's like, what are those three guys doing? They're costing, but they're not adding anything. And so that's the general theory behind the idea that the private sector is going to be better at delivering. Or sorry, not better. It's going to be more efficient at delivering in general than the government. The government doesn't have the same incentive to keep costs down. Okay. Any questions on the Phillips curve stuff? Any issues there? Yeah. Yeah. Yes, so when we have a fiscal or a monetary policy, what does that affect directly? It affects aggregate demand. Any fiscal or monetary policy action, and we saw that, remember, when we did those diagrams with the first and the second round effects. What is the end of the first round effect? A shift in aggregate demand. Whether it's fiscal or monetary policy, it's a shift in aggregate demand. Later on in the economy, when nominal wages adjust and those things, aggregate supply shifts as well. Those things shift in response, but that's not, what can I say, it's not a direct cause. You can link back causal all the way to wherever you want to, but directly, that's government and fiscal and monetary policy doesn't affect aggregate supply directly. Okay. Any other issues, questions, comments? No? Is it time for a break? Sorry. Let's have a break, 10 minutes, and then when we come back, what I would like to do is continue with the test 2 that we started on Friday, going through more of the stuff up to the point of the Phillips curve, so that we have some practice doing those Phillips curve questions as well. Yes.